This is Bio 100. Welcome. It is an introductory course to broadly cover the main concepts of the field of biology. So, what is biology? As the slide shows, the word biology is derived from the Greek words bios, meaning life, and logos, meaning to study, or the study of. It is defined as the science of life and living organisms. An organism is a living entity consisting of one cell, which could be bacteria, or several cells, an example, animals, plants, and fungi. Aspects of biological science range from the study of molecular mechanisms in cells to the classification and behavior of organisms, how species evolve, and the interaction between ecosystems. It covers a very, very broad range, and it covers just about everything that touches your life, whether you want to believe it or not. So that leads us directly into the question of why study biology. The simple generic answer is that we use biology to better understand the world around us and how we fit into it. Now, it gets much more complex and intricate than that. Sadly, this course will not be able to get into the really cool ways that biology affects our lives, but at least we will be able to touch on a few of the ways that it may reach your life directly. So, here are some common questions that are answered using knowledge gained from the study of biology. We all realize that today on this planet there are many, many different kinds of life forms, from ants and insects to the myriad of animals and plants that live in the rainforest. Biology is important to try to understand what is their role, how does their role affect ours. I know you may understand the more general themes of climate change and protecting the rainforest, but the more you study biology, the more you may realize that things are connected more than we know. This is also important to your health. How do mutations in genes lead to disease? One good example is cancer, or simple inherited diseases like Huntington's disease. We'll talk about that later. And the study of biology leads us to DNA. You've all heard of DNA at this point. In the 50s, nobody really could identify what it was or knew how important it was. But we know that it is what transfers your genetic information from generation to generation. It is essentially the blueprint for you, how you were built, how you digest food, what color your eyes are, what your hair is like, all of it. Now, if you've ever doubted the importance of biology in your life, here are some excellent items to consider before you discount an entire field of study. This is such an amazing time for this field, not only because of the discovery and the exploration of DNA and trying to figure out what it means, but in healthcare as well. Basically, I mentioned cancer earlier, but one question is, how do errors in DNA and cell growth lead to cancer? Cancer is essentially runaway cell division. This next question about plants and solar energy relates to you. Obviously, we all live in a world where you eat plants. You may not eat only plants, but the animals that you eat also eat plants, and then something eats us. It's all related to the food chain. Biology is absolutely crucial to understanding the food chain and our role in it. And just a couple other questions to go over. Now, biology isn't just a one-scale thing. Biologists study everything from molecules to living organisms on a global scale, like the interaction between the ozone layer and how it affects UV radiation in Antarctica, something along those lines. But it studies life, all of life. And it is critical to understand that biology and archaeology cycle much like nutrients and energy in an ecosystem. We use biology to understand some of the things scientists discover in archaeology, fossil records, chemical analysis of old stones, and so on. But at the same time, we use those records to try to understand what has brought us to the biological world we have today. What are some of the global patterns that occur in the hydrologic cycle or weather patterns? This again is related to climate change. Biology, well, maybe I'm overemphasizing the point that biology is critical to your life. So, when it comes to biology, there are 7 things that are considered the properties of life. You have order. There is a pattern to life. That they call it order, much like that pine cone where you see the shape, the patterns of it are obviously not random. There is a design. I should have picked a better word, but there's a pattern. B, if you go to regulation, to live in the environment changes, weather changes. Organisms, living things, must learn how to regulate their internal environment to stay alive within their external environment. We'll talk about growth and development. If something's alive, it grows and changes. There's usually a young stage, infant stage, maturation stage, and then reproduction and mature stage. Energy processing is another thing, obviously common to life. Everything's got to eat something. We also share a response to the environment. This particular picture shows a Venus flytrap. It doesn't find its food, but its food comes to it. It only knows it's there once it's triggered. So in order to stay alive, you've got to learn how to respond and react to things in your environment, either to get food, find a mate, or maintain your body temperature. Now this leads us obviously to reproduction. If you're alive, for some reason the biological imperative is to reproduce. And then finally, evolution. This is the ultimate unifying theme in biology. Things that are alive reproduce. This leads to a series of generations. We all know that each generation is not just like the one before it. There is variation. Different traits are inherited by each generation's offspring. Ultimately, and we'll get into this later, this is the basis of evolution. This is evolution. All things that are alive are privy to it. They evolve to some degree. Okay, so we'll start with order. I'll try not to go too in-depth here, but maybe you've noticed that life occurs in and with patterns. As humans, we're good at noticing patterns. The cycle of the seasons, the smell of the air before a storm, or maybe the way a family member's voice cracks when they're making up a story. Maybe that's something that's more familiar to you. But either way, that's one thing we're good at. We notice the patterns around us. We use it as a survival mechanism. Now, we can also use these patterns to anticipate occurrences in life if we take the time to track and study them carefully. We can learn specific details and intricacies about the biological world when we study biological patterns. This example photo, like you've just seen, shows the bottom of a pine cone. The pattern of the scales are fractal. If you get into higher math classes, you'll learn about fractals, or if you're an art major, you may already know about Fibonacci's sequence, also known as the golden ratio. Many aspects of nature, like this pine cone, follow the golden ratio. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the golden ratio. If you measure your arm from your fingertip to your elbow, and then measure from your fingertip to your wrist, and then divide the size of your hand, however number of inches or centimeters or whatever, divide that by the total measurement from your fingertip to your elbow, the ratio that you get, or the number, should be very close to what they call the golden ratio. Now, if you're interested in more on this, I definitely recommend you Google golden ratio, but essentially, I believe it's 1.618. Yeah, it's there on the slide. This is the perfect proportion. In art, if a body is proportioned exactly like this at every part, it is absolutely the most appealing to the human eye. It's really an amazing thing. I wish I had more time to go in it, but this is a biology class, not an art or math class. So let's move on to regulation. This is a lizard. And you know what it's doing. It's sunning itself. And we all know that this is how a lizard or reptiles this is how they regulate their body temperature. Something that has to use external influences to regulate their body temperature, like reptiles, are called poikilotherms. I won't make you remember that, but it's good to know. Now, we don't do that, right? We don't have to sun ourselves to warm up, to get our bodies functioning, to get our enzymes rolling again. We have an internal heater, so to speak. It is combustion. It's our metabolism. So that sustains our homeostasis, a regular state of being, and that's called a homeotherm. Now, as a living organism, this is a critical aspect of dealing with one's environment. We all know there are weather patterns, and there are few places on this planet that have completely static environments. This is a major driving force in evolution. We know that there are some bacteria that have learned to only thrive in the very, very hot thermal pools of Yellowstone, or at the vents at the bottom of the sea, or in sea ice, because they were outcompeted elsewhere. Well, maybe that's not the only reason, but generally it is. Or there are the rest of the living organisms, plants, animals, so on. I'm sure you're aware that most of them occur only in certain places, because that is where they can withstand the environmental fluctuations. Okay, moving on to growth and development. So, if something's alive, there is a beginning point to its life, and from there, that's obviously growth and development. In humans, like we're most familiar with, we all have an infant stage, a childhood stage, an adolescent stage, and then finally we reach adulthood. This same thing goes for plants, obviously animals, birds, even bacteria and fungi have these stages in their life process. There is some level of infancy right after birth or generation. I'll say birth even though some things hatch from eggs, or bacteria are basically the cells divide, binary fission, but we call that the birth point, essentially, where then they have to begin to gather nutrients again to become larger and better sustain their biological processes, and then at one point an organism will have enough energy to, if it's a bacteria, divide again, or if it's a living organism, reproduce, and that's something that all living things have in common. Moving on to energy processing, I guess maybe this should come before growth and development, but in order to grow and develop, something needs energy, and you get energy from food, whatever your source of food is. For plants, they use sunlight and minerals from the soil. Obviously for birds, fish, humans, we eat either plants or animals to obtain energy. It's really an elegant cycle where the energy comes from the sun, is manufactured by the plant into something that we can use. Now, at each stage, energy is transferred. Some of it is also lost as heat, especially with birds, fish, humans, that level of the ecosystem. We metabolize things, so we generate an internal heat, and a lot of heat is lost. So moving on to a response to the environment is something that also every living thing does in order to find food, protect itself from predators, or try to protect itself from the environment. It's all in the name of survival. And you all know this, but you have to respond to the environment in some way to continue to live. That's the point, and then to eventually reproduce. And moving on, there we go, moving on to reproduction. It's something all living things generally do. Humans are kind of an oddball oddball in the bunch, but it is the goal. It's the primary objective. Technically, in ecology, your fitness is 0 if you do not reproduce. It's sort of an interesting situation, but that's how you keep your species, your line, going. Why this is the biological imperative is a philosophical question, and you'll have to bring that up in another class. Again, evolution. We've already talked a lot about evolution. If something is alive, it must obey the laws of evolution. There are so many aspects of it. Even humans, even though we may not sure exactly how they are or how natural selection plays on us, it does. Finally, those are the things that all life has in common, but life exists at, of course, many different levels. We've already discussed this a little bit, going from molecules to cells, on up into the entire biosphere. That's a huge range. You're going from microscopic to global. Here's the chart from your book that hopefully you've already read. It goes the opposite direction. Looking at the biosphere first, we're looking at things like climate change, wind patterns, where they can carry nutrients from the desert on one continent across the ocean, pick up something else and drop it off on another continent, which may become an integral part to some microscopic fungi, which is critical to a plant, which may be critical to some other organism's existence. But on the scale of things, biosphere is the largest. Ecosystem is the second largest scale, as it includes several populations, several different species, or as many that are in that area. Communities are a group of individuals living within the same smaller area. An ecosystem is rather encompassing. It's like all of the grassland. But a community may be the series of species that live in a particular hectare, or 10 to 20 acres. I'm just trying to give an example, where an ecosystem may be more along the size scale version of a state or a few states of of our country. Communities may thrive more on like several counties size scale. I hope that's a good description. Anyway, populations are a population of individuals of the same species. You can also study biology at that level. Or you can study biology at the level of the organism, number 5. That's looking at the organism and its relationships just in its own life. Moving on to number 6 is where you start going into an individual organism, where you look at how it functions on the inside, using its organs, its transfer systems. Moving to a smaller scale from organs, you go into its tissues. Individual tissues can bring you to the microscopic level, where cells make up those tissues. You can study just simply the functioning of cells. Whole lifetimes have been spent studying just cells. Perhaps then move into the cell. There are organelles. Basically, like a body has organs, a cell has organelles. Sort of like just smaller versions of organs. That's what I think of when I think of organelle. But the nucleus is sort of the control center of a cell. That, we'll talk more about the organelles within a cell, but once you go into the nucleus, you start getting into some really interesting molecular and atomic structures, essentially, and most importantly, DNA, like you see in the picture here. Okay, now following along with your book, they take a closer look at ecosystems. This is looking at a scale, obviously, as the slide says, where each organism interacts with its environment. And it's not like that's just on a minute-to-minute basis. There's no choice. It happens all the time. 2 aspects of an ecosystem that biologists can look at are living and non-living factors. I'd like you to remember the terms biotic for living, so just like biology, and abiotic for non-living. This again comes down to Greek or Latin, and I can't remember which, where When you put the A in front of something, it sort of means counter or non. So hopefully that'll help. Biotic is living and abiotic is non-living. So a biotic factor in an ecosystem would obviously be an organism, like a snail or a fish or a bird or something. An abiotic factor in the environment is something that is non-living, like the wind or the temperature, the sunlight, perhaps water. Now I'm just saying water on a chemical level because if you pull water out of a pond, you are going to find many, many, many little living things in it. So an ecosystem consists of all the living organisms within a specific area. The living things and the non-living things in that area. And an ecosystem is generally a very, very large area, like I mentioned before. The interactions and the exchange of energy and nutrients in these ecosystems are the two main driving forces. One thing to keep in mind is that nutrients are cycled within the system and energy flows through. I mentioned this before, where energy essentially comes in from the sun, so it's coming from an exterior source. It's captured by plants when they do photosynthesis, which is really an amazing thing, how they're able to turn that into carbohydrates, which are essentially sugars. They use those to maintain and build their bodies, which are most often eaten by another individual. That individual obtains energy from eating that plant, but in doing so, that individual also burns energy. So every time there is a transfer of energy, there is a loss of heat, and that loss of heat exits the ecosystem entirely. This is counter to the idea of the nutrients, where if you look at something like the nitrogen in an ecosystem, there is a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere, usually in the form of N2. It's a gas, basically nitrogen gas. It's got a triple bond between it. It's a very, very strong bond. It takes a lot of energy to break that bond, but often lightning does, or some other things. Sometimes it can be brought out of the atmosphere by rain. Now, this is all within the ecosystem, because remember, the atmosphere is a part of the abiotic part of the ecosystem. So then the nitrogen with rain after lightning is brought to the surface of the earth, to the ground. And the rainwater will help bring that nitrogen into the soil. Nitrogen is a critical element for plant growth. It's actually part of what they use to look green. If you have a houseplant at home and it's starting to look a little yellow, it probably needs nitrogen. So that plant then uses the nitrogen it uptakes it through its roots, starts building leafy material or root material, which is then eaten by another individual. That nitrogen is then transferred to whatever eats it, and nitrogen is a critical component of many proteins, enzymes, even DNA. So it becomes a part of a new organism until something eats that organism, say it's a bunny, or it dies and eventually decomposes, and some of that nitrogen is recycled back into the ecosystem. So that is an element that does not necessarily leave the ecosystem. It may transfer ecosystems, but it's not like light and energy, which simply comes in and leaves. Here's an excellent diagram to show you what exactly I'm talking about. So the energy is the squiggly yellow, orange, and red line that flows through the picture, and the cycle of nutrients will be the blue circle there. You can think of nitrogen, or you can think of carbon. Carbon is a really popular one to think of elements that cycle through a system, or even water. Water cycles through on a much faster scale. So take some time, get to know this picture. Maybe you'll have to draw it later, who knows. So moving out of ecosystems, your book goes directly into cells and DNA. Cells have an amazingly intricate way in which they function, and DNA governs the whole thing. Basically, there are little ribosomes and other things that read chunks of the DNA and basically copy it, make little messages, which we'll call RNA, that are then transferred outside the nucleus to other organelles within the cell. This RNA is read and provides the instructions to build proteins. Proteins can be enzymes, building blocks for your body, any number of different things. But generally, if something's alive, it has a cell, it is required to follow this process to maintain function. Everything from bacteria to, humans. Now, cells are integral to life. Yes. Now we know bacteria is much different than a human, and they are different at a cellular level. There are two main kinds of cells: prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic are much simpler. They do not have a nucleus, as you guys read. But eukaryotic cells do have nuclei. Bacteria are prokaryotic, humans are eukaryotic. Here's that lovely picture from your book. You can see there's a huge difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. There's a wonderful theory behind it too as to how these differences came to be, but that's something we'll discuss a little more later. I'm trying really hard to remember not to go too deep into these things, but remember the main differences. That is absolutely critical. Prokaryotic cells are small, simple. DNA is concentrated in a region, but is not necessarily within a nucleus, and they really do not have many organelles. A eukaryotic cell has a nucleus. It takes up a good part of the cell, typically. It's large, it's complex, and there are many, many organelles, mitochondria, ribosomes. We'll discuss more about that later. So, we've discussed DNA. DNA is something we're going to become very familiar with. It contains all of your genetic material, all of the genetic codes to do everything that you do. It also passes on all of the instructions to your offspring, and is made up of only 4 possible bases, or base pairs: A, G, C, and T. A and T are always paired, and G and C are always paired. So what's most amazing about life and DNA is that all living things have the same kind of DNA. DNA has the same structure. It works the same way. There are 4 building blocks to DNA. And then when you look at all of life on the planet, when you consider there are just 4 main building blocks, and then this incredible array of diversity. It's one of the most amazing things I can think about. Even though we're all different, we're made of the same stuff. So there is incredible diversity on the planet. And in order to understand it, we need to group things into pairs, or not into pairs, I'm sorry, find groupings, find some way to identify, understand, and name what we're talking about so that we can communicate more clearly. I hope it doesn't seem too overwhelming yet, all of the different aspects of biology that there are, but it is. It's amazing. There are many, many different things. So we categorize these items to help us understand and talk about them. Taxonomy is a term that's used, or taxonomy is the discipline that describes and categorizes life, essentially. It comes up with the names, what do we call something that we just discover, and creates a formal outline for us to follow. So what we're going to start off with here in class are the big ones. It gets much more detailed. We'll touch on that later, but initially everything is grouped into 3 separate domains: archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. So bacteria is pretty obvious. Bacteria are bacteria. Eukarya are, much like we talked about before, there are the 2 different kinds of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The eukarya domain encompasses everything that has a complex cell structure. Now, if we go back to archaea, this is essentially describing a life form that's not quite as detailed as bacteria. There are some living things that don't have all of the aspects that bacteria has, but they are alive, they are prehistoric, and they still exist. So they're grouped into archaea. It's a more general study. I don't know much about it. I don't know many of the details, so that's all we're really going to go into archaea. Bacteria are more important to our everyday lives, as are eukarya. So it's also important to see where eukarya is a huge domain. It encompasses many kingdoms, kingdom plantae, plants, fungi, and animals. Those are what we will discuss most because that's what we encounter most. Protists are also grouped in there. There are multiple kingdoms of protists, but it takes, as far as I'm concerned, a relatively specialized level of understanding, study to understand the differences there. So we're not going to do a whole lot with that. We will hopefully get to look at some protists under the microscope, but we will move forward. As I've mentioned before, there is a great unity within this diversity. We talked about DNA. We've all got the same DNA, although we are all on this planet different. DNA and evolution are the two most unifying aspects of biology. It's one of the most amazing things to me is that everything that's alive is made of the same building blocks, and everything that's alive also follows the rules. And I said laws before of evolution. Even though evolution is just a theory, there aren't really laws about it, but it has several supporting ideologies. They aren't laws. It was inappropriate for me to say so. But you can't escape it. Evolution is a unifying theme of biology, and all of biology is based on DNA. So, evolution. Evolution is documented. Yes, it's just a theory, but it's a very, very, very well supported theory. Everything is constantly changing. This is just a picture of human skulls from as far back as we can tell. And looking at eyes are much larger. The part of the skull that holds the brain is much smaller, and you can see a slow transition from skull A to skull B, all the way up to today. Gradually, our brains got larger, and in comparison to our facial features. Obviously, we're talking about evolution, and you have heard of Darwin. He was the first one to publish his ideas on evolution. He was not the first one to think of it, but he's the first to get it published, so that's who we refer to. He published The Origin of Species, obviously, in 1859. It consists of two main points. He had this thought that everything living today descended from a succession of ancestral species. He called it descent with modification. We will get a chance, we will go way in depth into this later in the semester. And everything that's alive undergoes or submits to the process of natural selection, not by choice, just by the factors that live around it in its ecosystem. Everything adapts to its environment and is a result of that. Things that are better adapted to their environment reproduce more, so those genes proliferate through the population. It's very simple. His ultimate, inescapable conclusion was actually very, very simple. He had all the pieces. Generations change, offspring change from generation to generation, and it's often a reflection of the environment that they live in. Those that are better equipped to live in their environment produce more, and therefore they dictate what the future generation will be like. If you follow that thought process through hundreds of generations, you can see evolution. Basically, his simple initial observation was that populations they have the capacity to overproduce, but at the same time they compete with each other for resources. And so basically a population can produce, or any population can produce far more offspring than the environment can hold. And all of those individuals within a population are competing with each other for resources, food, mates, space to live, things like that. The second observation is that each individual varies, and each individual has a different capacity to reproduce or compete. Ultimately, this means that every individual has different reproductive success. Not everybody has the same number of children. Not everybody has access to the same amount of food. This is true in human populations as well as wild populations. This is what Darwin called natural selection. The product of natural selection, once natural selection plays on a population for a generation or two, this is called adaptation. Now, I want you to understand a very clear difference between adaptation and acclimation. Adaptation occurs through generations. One individual cannot adapt to their environment. They can acclimate. You can move from Phoenix to Prescott and get used to the weather difference. An individual can do that, but that is not adaptation. Adaptation occurs through generations. Essentially, the ultimate conclusion, what you need to understand about natural selection is that it is the mechanism of evolution. So there are several ways to observe natural selection. A very common way to try to describe it, you will see in these 4 pictures here. In the top picture, there is a population of beetles. They generally have different colors, like, say, imagine ladybugs. Some ladybugs are dark red. You've seen some orange ladybugs, maybe those that are a color in between. So even though these don't look like ladybugs, that's the same principle. One population can have variable colors, and that will have an influence on the rate at which predators are able to find them and eat them, essentially. Say their environment is very dark. Say they live in dark plants or on the north side of a mountain where there doesn't happen to be a whole lot of sun. Birds will hone in on the beetles that are of a lighter color, and those beetles will tend to survive less, reproduce less, and will have a lower impact on the genetic code in future generations. So eventually, over time, the ultimate beetle population will lose the genes for lighter colored individuals. If you can see the difference from the top picture to the bottom picture, there aren't as many light colored beetles. Now, another form of natural selection would be artificial selection. How in the world do you get a chihuahua from a wolf? But this is something you've known about your whole life. This is something humans have done with wolf or dog genes. A wolf and dog are like 99.99 something like that percent the same. It's really rather amazing. So selection isn't something that only happens as a result of nature, but it is something that affects the frequency or the proportion or the kind of genes that exist on it and are expressed within a population. Now, we're going to move to the importance of the process of science. A lot of people don't have much faith in scientific study, which saddens me to a great degree, because science, if one follows the process of science rigorously, as most scientists do and should, it's almost religious in a way, although I really don't want to mention religion in this class. Science is derived from the Latin verb meaning to know. Science is a way of methodically trying to understand something based on questions. Within the scientific process, there are 2 main approaches. Discovery science is about describing nature. That's more along the lines of qualitative aspects of biology, or hypothesis-driven science, which is mostly about explaining nature. So one is more based on observations, the other is, well, although observation is the first step to any scientific method, the other is coming up with questions and finding the answers. So the process of science follows something we call the scientific method, and it seeks an understanding or a way to measure and describe natural phenomena. This limits science to pretty much what can be measured. Even though some questions involve qualitative aspects of, say, a population, like color, how do you measure color? Other types of questions rely on quantitative, where you measure the number of individuals or the size or the average weight of a population. The scientific process depends on observations that one makes and what sort of evidence will support that and how it's tested. Here's the gist of it. You start with an observation, which leads to a question. Your question leads to a hypothesis, which leads to a prediction, but then you run the experiment, and you have to be completely open to the fact that you may be completely wrong with your prediction. This is something we're going to apply frequently in this class, and I want you to try to apply to other things in your life. So, I know that sometimes students come to science class expecting absolute facts and rigid dogma, sort of like a religion. There is no rigid dogma. The only rigid dogma is to follow the scientific method clearly, whether you are right or wrong. What I want you to understand is that scientific knowledge is tentative. It reflects degrees of confidence closely correlated to the strength of the evidence. I'm going to say that again because it's very important. Scientific knowledge is tentative. It reflects degrees of confidence closely correlated to the strength of the evidence. There's a phrase where people say the data are what the data are. You cannot influence or control the data. Once you do, your scientific method is screwed. It's not the scientific method. Whatever the result of your experiment is, you can't try to manipulate and guide it to get the answer that you want. That defeats the purpose, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. We also want you to be sure to make the distinction between natural and supernatural explanations to a question. Scientific is limited to natural explanations. If it can't be measured, well, we can't really apply the scientific method to it, or even though we'll try as much as possible. Another thing to understand is when you run an experiment, you will have a controlled aspect of this experiment, some part where you don't change anything. So that way, when you change one variable at a time, you can determine which one had an effect. We'll try to go over this more in class because it's easier to show. Moving on to scientific theory. Once an idea or hypothesis has withstood many, many rounds of the scientific method. One thing I forgot to mention about the scientific method, any experiment that you come up with, you have to include enough information when you write about it so that someone else can just pick it up, read it, and do the same thing exactly and get the same results. Anyway, besides that, I'm sorry. A scientific theory. How is this different from a hypothesis? A scientific theory is broader in scope than a hypothesis. It is widely accepted and widely supported by many different hypotheses. That's plural hypothesis, more than one. Now, scientific theories are an excellent way to try to understand and get to know nature, but they are not the only way. Science, religion, and art are just as valid in ways of exploring and trying to make sense of the world around us. Everybody has something that works better for them. I like science and art. Other people may have religion. We all seek to gain an understanding of the world around us and where we belong. We can have different methods to do so. It's good to understand as many as possible. Now this is, in your book, this is not something that I'm very good at describing, but I'm going to really do my best. Obviously, science, technology, and society are very strongly intertwined. Science provides the method by which we test and develop technology. And once technology enters our society, it can change it for better or worse. It can improve our standard of living, but we don't know the consequences that may have on our psyches, or As our standards of living improve, standards of living in other places may go down drastically. It's just very simple. Other problems that we have are, some people may have heard this before, better living through chemistry. The chemical industry is constantly developing new substances that are made to try and make our lives easier and better. But sometimes the problem with synthetic chemicals is that they do not break down in the environment, and it can take decades before we know that, I don't know, say the newest alternative form of sugar will cause cancer 30 years down the road. Who knows? I'm not saying that that's something that's happened, but it's always a possibility. And with every new development, every new chemical that's released into the environment, there are unlimited numbers of consequences, unknown and unintended consequences. So, in summary, the main points I want you guys to look at and to get to know is the 7 common traits to living things. That biology studies life at many different scales. Ecosystems are where organisms interact and cycle energy and nutrients. Cells have many, many parts, and DNA is a critical part of all cell functioning. Living things are grouped into domains and kingdoms. Know the domains and kingdoms and their aspects, or what they contain in general. The ultimate and unifying theme in biology is the theory of evolution. Great diversity lies in unity. DNA, evolution, the diversity of life. It's really amazing. The scientific method is employed to manage and explore scientific questions. It's just a brief rundown of everything we've gone over. I've tried to be detailed. I need to be more careful with my words, but this is what your first assignment will be on, and what we will have a short quiz over when we meet next week.